Welcome to Mr. Keelan's Stories. Get ready for a journey full of thrill, emotion, and powerful messages that will touch your heart. This video isn't just a story, it's an experience, one that will leave you thinking, feeling, and inspired. Stay tuned for a thrilling, emotional, and heartwarming journey, one that will leave you speechless. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Now, let's begin. Helen Carter sat in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at her reflection with hollow eyes. The golden silk gown she wore shimmered under the chandelier's glow, but it felt like a cage rather than a dress. Tomorrow, she would no longer be Helen Carter. She would become Helen Blackwood, the wife of Jack Blackwood, the man whose very name sent a chill down her spine. Her hands trembled as she reached for the diamond necklace her mother had gifted her that morning. "You should be grateful, Helen," her mother had said with a forced smile. "Jack is one of the most powerful men in the country. With him, you'll never have to worry about anything. Anything. Except her happiness. Except her freedom." Jack Blackwood was not a man women dreamed of marrying. He was not a prince charming, nor a man of gentle words and soft touches. He was a businessman, cold, calculative, and ruthless. He built his empire by crushing people under his feet, and Helen had witnessed it firsthand. She remembered the day she met him for the first time. Her father had invited him over for dinner, discussing business deals while Helen sat silently, forced to listen. Jack never smiled. He barely looked at her except when he wanted to make a point. His voice was sharp, his words precise, and his eyes, a deep, piercing grey, were like ice. "You will marry me, Helen," he had said that night, swirling a glass of wine in his hand. "It's best if you accept it now, rather than waste your energy fighting it." Her father had laughed at her silence. "She's just nervous," he said. "She's always been a little stubborn. But she'll come around." Come around. Like hell she would. Helen had tried to protest, tried to convince her parents that this was not the life she wanted. But her words fell on deaf ears. "This is for the family, Helen," her father had said sternly. "You're a Carter, and Carters don't make foolish decisions based on emotions." Her mother, always the quiet one, had simply squeezed her hand. "It's your duty, sweetheart." Duty. That was all she was to them, a bargaining chip, a tool to strengthen their business empire. No one cared if she was happy, no one cared if she was terrified. And now, as she sat in her bedroom, the reality of it all crashed down on her. Tomorrow, she would be tied to a man who didn't love her, a man who didn't care about her. She closed her eyes, trying to suppress the tears. There had to be a way out. She walked toward the large window in her room, staring out at the vast city skyline. People down below lived their lives freely, making choices, falling in love, chasing their dreams. But she was nothing but a prisoner in a golden cage. She thought of Jack's reputation, how he fired employees without a second thought, how he shut down businesses with a snap of his fingers, how people feared him more than they respected him. He was a man with no heart, only ambition. Would she become just another one of his possessions? Would he control her the way he controlled his business? A shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't let this happen. But what could she do? She had no one to turn to, no one who would help her escape this fate. Or maybe she did. Her heartbeat quickened as an idea formed in her mind, an idea so reckless, so dangerous, but also her only chance at freedom. Helen turned away from the window, determination flickering in her eyes. If no one would save her, she would save herself. The grand chandelier in the foyer cast long shadows across the marble floors, and the ticking of an antique clock echoed through the vast hallways. Everyone in the house was asleep, oblivious to the storm raging inside Helen's heart. She stood at the edge of her bed, a small duffel bag in her trembling hands. It held only the essentials: a few clothes, cash she had secretly saved, and a burner phone she had bought weeks ago, fearing she might need it. This was it. This was the moment where she had to decide. Stay and become a prisoner in a loveless marriage, or run and risk everything. Her heart pounded so loudly she was afraid someone might hear it. Her hands were slick with sweat as she grabbed the doorknob. Slowly, carefully, she turned it. The door creaked slightly, and she froze, holding her breath. Her parents' room was just down the hall, and if they caught her now, there would be no escape. Seconds passed. No movement. She exhaled, inching the door open and slipping into the dimly lit hallway. The mansion, which had once felt like home, now felt like a prison. Each step she took toward the grand staircase felt like walking through a battlefield. If she made a sound, if she got caught, she would be dragged back, forced into a future she wanted no part of. Halfway down the stairs, she heard a noise, footsteps. Her breath hitched. She pressed herself against the cold wooden railing, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag tightly. "Please don't come this way." A figure emerged from the shadows, the butler, Mr. Holloway. Helen's stomach twisted in fear. He had been with the family for years, always loyal to her father. If he saw her sneaking out, he would alert the entire household. She clenched her fists, willing herself to stay calm. Mr. Holloway sighed, rubbing his temples. He walked past the staircase, heading toward the kitchen. He didn't see her. Helen let out a slow, shaky breath. "Go! Now!" She darted down the rest of the stairs, her feet barely making a sound on the polished floor. Reaching the side entrance, she pressed her hand against the cold brass doorknob. Freedom was just beyond this door. She twisted it, locked. Her heart dropped. Of course, her parents would make sure all doors were locked at night. She fumbled in her pocket for the spare key she had stolen from the maid's quarters earlier that day. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. She shoved the key into the lock, twisting it frantically. She pushed the door open and slipped outside. The night air hit her like a wave of cold reality. For the first time in her life, she was outside alone. No security, no cameras, no one watching her every move. But there was no time to celebrate. She needed to get far away, fast. She ran through the vast garden, her shoes sinking into the damp grass. The grand estate's iron gates loomed ahead. She pressed her back against the cold metal and reached for the lock. Another problem. The gates required an access code. Helen knew it, of course, but typing it in would trigger a silent alarm. Her pulse raced. "Think, Helen, think." Then she spotted it, the small gap at the bottom of the fence, hidden by thick rose bushes. It was barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. She didn't hesitate. She crouched down and crawled through the dirt, the thorns scratching at her arms and tearing at her dress. Pain flared up her legs, but she gritted her teeth. Freedom was worth every scratch. As she emerged on the other side, her hands were bloodied, her dress was torn, but she was free. Run! Helen sprinted down the dark, empty road, her lungs burning with every step. She had no plan, no destination. All she knew was that she had to get far away from Jack Blackwood and her family before they realized she was gone. After what felt like hours, she finally slowed down. A bus station. The old rusted sign flickered under the dim streetlight, casting eerie shadows on the pavement. There were only a few people waiting. A tired-looking old man, a woman rocking a baby in her arms, and a man sitting alone on a bench. Helen's chest rose and fell rapidly as she struggled to catch her breath. Her legs ached and her arms stung from the scratches, but none of that mattered. She was away from them. But what now? She had no friends outside her wealthy bubble, no one she could trust. Her eyes drifted to the man on the bench. He was different. Something about him made her pause. He had dark, warm eyes that reflected years of struggle. His posture was relaxed, but there was an unmistakable strength in the way he sat, as if he had learned to survive the hardest of times. His skin was rough from labor, his clothes simple but neat. Helen didn't know why, but she felt drawn to him. She took a deep breath, then slowly walked toward him. The man looked up as she approached, his gaze calm but observant. She hesitated, her throat dry. What was she doing? She had no idea who he was. He could be dangerous, but something inside her whispered that she could trust him. With a shaky voice she said, I need help." The man studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the seat next to him. "Sit," he said simply. Helen sank onto the bench, her entire body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The man looked at her again, really looked. Not like Jack, who saw her as a trophy, and not like her father, who saw her as a business deal. This man saw her as a person. He sighed, leaning back against the bench. "You're running from something," he said quietly. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Helen's lips quivered. "Yes." The man was silent for a long moment before he spoke again. "I don't know what you're running from," he said, "but if you need a place to stay, I have a small place nearby." Helen's heart pounded. He was offering her shelter. Should she trust him? She had no idea who he was, but then again, did she have any other choice? For the first time that night, she let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. "Okay," the man stood up, offering her his hand. "I'm James." Helen hesitated, then slowly placed her hand in his. "I'm Helen." And just like that, her life changed forever. The streetlights cast a dim glow as Helen followed James through the quiet, empty roads. The world around them was eerily silent, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a stray dog. Helen's heart pounded in her chest. Was she making a mistake? She didn't know this man. He could be dangerous. He could be leading her into a trap. But something inside her, a deep, unexplainable instinct, told her she could trust him. She studied him as they walked. James was nothing like the men she grew up around. The businessmen in her world wore expensive suits, drove luxury cars, and carried an air of arrogance. They talked about money, power, and control, but James was different. He wore a simple, worn-out denim jacket over a black t-shirt. His jeans had faded patches and his boots were scuffed. His hands, large, strong, and rough, looked like they had known hard labor, but his eyes were warm. Helen shivered, hugging herself as a cold wind blew past. James glanced at her. Without a word, he took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. Helen stiffened. No man had ever done something like that for her, not without expecting something in return. "Thank you," she murmured. James just nodded. "It's not far." They walked in silence until they reached a small, run-down apartment building. The paint was peeling, and the stairwell smelled of damp wood. It was nothing like the grand mansions she had been raised in. James led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor and unlocked a wooden door. He pushed it open and gestured for her to step inside. Helen hesitated for only a second before crossing the threshold. Inside, the apartment was tiny but warm. A single bed sat against the far wall, covered with a simple grey blanket. A small couch, a cluttered desk, and a tiny kitchen with barely enough space for one person made up the rest of the room. It was modest, lived in, safe. James walked to the kitchen and grabbed a kettle. "You want tea?" Helen nodded, still taking in her surroundings. She had lived in castles, but she had never felt at home. Here, in this tiny apartment that smelled of old books and coffee, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Comfort. James handed her a steaming cup and sat across from her. Helen wrapped her hands around the warmth of the mug and took a small sip. The heat soothed her frayed nerves, and for the first time that night she breathed. James leaned back in his chair, watching her. "So, who are you running from?" Helen's throat tightened. She could lie. She could tell him she was just passing through, but something about him made her want to tell the truth. I'm supposed to get married tomorrow, she whispered, staring into her tea. James raised an eyebrow. You don't sound happy about it. Helen let out a bitter laugh. Because I'm not. She hesitated, then continued, her voice softer. It's not love. It's a business deal. My parents are forcing me to marry a man who doesn't have a heart. James stayed silent, letting her speak. Helen swallowed hard. I had no choice. My whole life. I've done what my parents told me. But tonight I ran. Her voice cracked at the last word, and she hated herself for sounding weak. James studied her for a long moment, then said, You're braver than you think. Helen looked up, surprised. No one had ever called her brave before. My parents don't think so, she murmured. They think I'm selfish, that I should be grateful. James exhaled, shaking his head. Grateful for what? A life that isn't yours? Helen's lips parted slightly. He understood. No one had ever understood before. Her whole life she had been told what to do, who to be. She had been treated like a pawn, a doll, a silent decoration. But James was treating her like a person. Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. James sipped his tea. You know, I grew up in a world where choices weren't always mine either. Helen tilted her head. What do you mean? He set his cup down. I grew up in a rough neighborhood. My mom worked 3 jobs to keep us fed. My father left before I was born. Everyone told me I'd either end up dead or in jail. Helen's heart clenched. James leaned back, his voice quieter now. But I wanted more. I worked hard, got out, built a life for myself. Helen stared at him, realizing something. He had fought for his freedom, just like she was trying to do now. You're strong, she said before she could stop herself. James gave a small chuckle. So are you. Helen shook her head. I'm just a coward who ran away. James looked at her, his gaze steady. You ran towards something better. Helen swallowed past the lump in her throat. Why did this stranger see her in a way no one else ever had? They sat in silence for a while, sipping their tea. Then James stood up. You should get some sleep. You can take the bed. Helen's eyes widened. No, I can't. James held up a hand. I'll sleep on the couch. It's fine. Helen hesitated. No man in her world would give up his comfort for a woman, not unless he expected something in return. But James simply grabbed a blanket and stretched out on the couch without another word. Helen stood frozen, staring at him. She had spent years surrounded by powerful men with cold hearts. But here, in a tiny apartment, with a stranger who had nothing to gain from helping her. For the first time in a long, long time, she felt safe. As she lay down on the bed, pulling the blanket around her, a single thought echoed in her mind. Maybe this was the first night of her real life, and for the first time in years, Helen closed her eyes and slept without fear. The first thing Helen noticed was the warmth. A golden light bathed the small room, stretching across the wooden floor and casting a soft glow over everything. The distant hum of the city outside was muffled, almost peaceful. For a brief, blissful moment, she forgot. She forgot about the forced marriage. She forgot about Jack Blackwood. She forgot about the prison of her old life. But then it all came rushing back. Helen sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. She wasn't in her childhood bedroom, nor in a luxury hotel arranged by her wealthy parents. She was in James's apartment. The realization sent a jolt of uncertainty through her. Then, the scent of coffee and something warm and buttery filled the air. She turned her head. James was standing by the small kitchen counter, his back to her. He was making breakfast, his broad shoulders relaxed, his movements easy. Helen swallowed, watching him. No man in her world cooked for himself. The men she knew had chefs, servants, people to cater to their every whim. But James moved through the kitchen with quiet confidence, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs and flipping something on an old skillet. For some reason, that simple act made her chest tighten. He turned slightly and caught her staring. "You're awake," he said with a small smile. His voice was calm, warm, like the first sip of tea on a cold morning. Helen quickly looked away, embarrassed. Yeah." She glanced at the tiny clock on the wall. It was past 8. If she had been home, she would have been waking up to a team of stylists preparing her for a wedding she didn't want. But instead, she was here. And for the first time in forever, she wasn't being told what to do. James placed a plate on the table, a simple breakfast of scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh fruit. He sat across from her, sliding one of the coffee mugs toward her. Helen hesitated. No one had ever made her breakfast before. She had been served by chefs in crisp white uniforms, her meals placed before her like works of art. But this was different. It was made with care. "Eat," James said, taking a bite of his toast. Helen picked up the fork slowly. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite hit her tongue. It was simple but perfect. For a while they ate in comfortable silence. Then James leaned back in his chair. His gaze was steady but not harsh. "You're safe here," he said, sipping his coffee. "But I have to ask, no, what are you running from?" Helen tensed. She should have expected the question. He had been kind enough to offer her shelter for the night, but he deserved to know the truth. Still, the words were hard. She stared down at her coffee, watching the steam rise. I was supposed to get married today." Her voice was barely above a whisper. James didn't speak, didn't push. He just waited. Helen inhaled deeply, then let it all spill out. "I grew up in a world where I never got to make choices," she said, her fingers tightening around the mug. "My parents believe in power, in wealth. To them, I'm not a daughter, I'm an investment." She swallowed, forcing herself to continue. "My father arranged my marriage to Jack Blackwood, a businessman, ruthless, cold. I barely know him, but I've seen enough to know he's dangerous." James's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Helen's throat burned. "They never asked if I wanted this. They never cared. To them, love is weakness. Happiness doesn't matter. Only control." She let out a shaky breath. "So I ran." James exhaled through his nose, setting his coffee down. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Good." Helen blinked. "What?" "You did the right thing," he said simply. She let out a bitter laugh. "My parents wouldn't think so." "They don't matter," James said firmly. "This is your life, Helen, not theirs." She stared at him. No one had ever said those words to her before. This is your life. She had spent so long being told what to do, what to wear, how to act, who to marry. She had never truly considered that her life could belong to her. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. James ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. "I won't ask you to stay," he said, his voice softer now, "but if you need help, I'm here." Helen's fingers curled around the fabric of her borrowed sweater. His sweater. She didn't know what she had expected when she ran into the night. Maybe to be caught. Maybe to fail. But she hadn't expected kindness. A lump formed in her throat. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James looked at her, his gaze unreadable. "Because I know what it's like," he said finally. "To feel trapped, to want more." Helen's chest tightened. For a long moment, they just sat there. Two strangers bound by nothing except the quiet understanding that sometimes the world wasn't kind. Helen wiped at her eyes before any tears could fall. She couldn't stay forever. James had given her a night of safety, of warmth. But she knew she had to keep moving. If her father found her, if Jack Blackwood realized she had escaped, she shuddered. "I should go," she said softly, though the thought made her stomach twist. James studied her for a long moment, then nodded. All right? He didn't argue. He didn't tell her she was being stupid. He just accepted her choice. Helen stood, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. This was it. She had to go. But her feet wouldn't move, because for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be alone. For the first time in her life, she wanted to stay, and that terrified her more than anything. Jack Blackwood stood in the center of his grand, marble-floored office, his hands clenched into fists. The air was thick with tension, his rage simmering beneath the surface like a dormant volcano ready to erupt. The wedding was supposed to be flawless, a perfect business merger, another calculated move in his empire. And yet, she ran. Helen Carter, the woman who was supposed to stand beside him in front of flashing cameras, had disappeared. Jack's jaw tightened as his sharp gaze fell on his assistant, Marcus, who stood nervously across the room. She left last night, Marcus reported carefully, knowing how easily his boss's anger could explode. No one saw her go. She took nothing valuable, just vanished. Jack's grip tightened around the crystal tumbler in his hand. How dare she? Not because he loved her. No, love was a foolish, insignificant thing. But no one, absolutely no one, made a fool of Jack Blackwood. His father had built a legacy of power and control, and Jack had spent years perfecting that dominance. A missing bride? A public humiliation? He could already hear the whispers in the elite circles. Did you hear? Jack Blackwood's fiancée ran away before the wedding? A Carter daughter refused to marry into the Blackwood Empire? What scandal? Maybe she found out something about him. Maybe she's afraid of him. His blood boiled. He would not be humiliated. He set his drink down with a controlled motion, then turned to his men. Find her. His voice was dangerously calm. I don't care how. I don't care where. I want Helen Carter in front of me by the end of the day. His men exchanged uneasy glances. Sir, if we use too much force, the media might... Jack's glare was lethal. I don't care about the media, he snapped. She belongs to me, and no one runs from me. His men scurried out of the room, phones already dialing, instructions already being sent. Jack exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temples. Helen Carter had no idea who she was running from, but she would soon find out. Meanwhile, miles away, Helen Carter breathed. She stood on the balcony of a small cafe, sipping on a warm cup of coffee. The morning breeze danced through her hair, and for the first time in years, she felt something foreign, something delicate, something she had never truly known. Freedom. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Last night, she had woken up in a bed that wasn't made of silk, but had brought her more comfort than any luxury ever could. She had eaten breakfast prepared by a man who expected nothing in return. She had spoken her truth, and for the first time ever, someone had listened. And now? Now she was standing under the open sky, no longer a prisoner in her golden cage. She wanted to laugh at how simple it was, how easy it had been to walk away. Why hadn't she done this sooner? She turned, her eyes landing on James. He was seated across from her, sipping his coffee, watching the street below. He was calm, steady, so different from the men in her world. A thought struck her. "What's stopping you?" she asked. James looked at her, brows slightly raised. "From what?" "From leaving." She gestured vaguely. "This life? This place? Don't you ever want more?" He studied her for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I don't need more," he said simply. "I just need peace." Helen let those words sink in. She had spent her whole life chasing what others told her was important: money, status, power. But James had nothing of that, and yet he looked content. She envied him. But before she could say more, her phone buzzed. She froze. No one should be calling her. James noticed her expression shift. "What's wrong?" Helen swallowed and hesitantly pulled out the phone she had taken with her. She hadn't used it since running away. The screen lit up with a single name. Jack. Her stomach twisted. James leaned forward slightly, sensing her tension. "Who is it?" Helen didn't answer. Her thumb hovered over the decline button. She could turn off the phone, pretend she never saw it, but a second later, another text came in. "I will find you, Helen." The words sent an icy shiver down her spine. She quickly turned off the phone, shoving it into her bag. Her breath was coming faster now, panic creeping into her chest. James frowned. "Helen." She stood up abruptly. "I need to go." James stood too, his concern deepening. "Go where?" She didn't know. She didn't have a plan. She just knew she couldn't stay in one place too long. Jack's reach was everywhere. James didn't press, but his gaze was sharp. "You're scared." Helen clenched her fists. "I'm being hunted." James was silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right," he said. "Then I'm coming with you." Helen blinked. "What?" James shrugged, picking up his jacket. "You need help, and I don't like the idea of you running alone." Helen's lips parted. No one had ever offered to stand by her side without a hidden agenda. James had no reason to help her. He owed her nothing. But here he was, choosing to stay. A lump formed in her throat, but she pushed it down. She wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, that meant she had a chance. The first time Helen held a tray of coffee in her hands, she almost dropped it. The cups rattled dangerously as she struggled to balance them. She had never done this before, never served anyone, never worked with her hands. Her entire life had been filled with maids, chauffeurs, and assistants who had taken care of everything. Now, she was the one taking orders. "Careful," James murmured beside her, steadying the tray with one hand before she could make a mess. His touch was light but grounding. "You'll get used to it." Helen let out a breath and nodded. She had to get used to it. This was her new reality. James had taken her to Rosewood Cafe, a cozy little coffee shop on the corner of a quiet street. It was the kind of place that smelled like cinnamon and fresh pastries, where regulars had their favorite seats and where the baristas knew their names. It was nothing like the world she had come from, glamorous, cold, unfeeling. But here, there was warmth. Here, she could breathe. James introduced her to Maria, the owner, a kind older woman with sharp eyes and a soft heart. "She's looking for work," James had said. "She's smart, a fast learner." Maria had looked Helen up and down, clearly noticing the expensive fabric of her borrowed sweater, the way she held herself, like someone who had never worked a day in her life. "Have you ever had a job before, sweetheart?" Maria asked. Helen hesitated. "Not exactly." Maria sighed but smiled. "All right. I'll give you a chance. You mess up my orders, you clean the tables, deal?" Helen nodded. That was how it began. The first few days were brutal. She burned her fingers on steaming coffee pots. She mixed up orders. She dropped a plate once, the crash echoing through the tiny cafe, humiliating her. But Maria never yelled. "Try again," was all she said, handing Helen a new cup. And so she did. Little by little she learned. She learned how to steam milk to the perfect temperature, how to write down orders quickly, how to smile at customers even when she was exhausted. She learned how to move fast, how to work with her hands, how to survive. For the first time in her life, Helen earned something. She wasn't given a designer handbag or a luxury car for existing. She worked, she sweat, she made mistakes and fixed them, and it felt incredible. James was there every step of the way. He showed up at the cafe every morning, sometimes to help, sometimes just to be there. He had become her closest friend, her anchor in this strange new life. They laughed in between shifts. He taught her how to make the perfect espresso. She made fun of how serious he looked when he was concentrating. One night, after a long shift, they sat outside on the cafe's back steps, watching the city lights flicker. Helen sighed, stretching her tired arms. "I've never been this exhausted before," James chuckled. "Feels good, though, doesn't it?" She smiled, surprising herself. "Yeah, it does." Silence settled between them, but it was comfortable. Then James spoke, his voice quieter this time. "You're doing good, Helen." She turned to him, her heart catching in her throat. No one had ever said that to her before. Not her father, not her mother, not even herself. For the first time, she felt like she was more than just someone's daughter, someone's fiancée, someone's problem to solve. She was Helen, and she was finally living. Even as she adjusted to this new life, even as she found joy in the little things, folding napkins, chatting with customers, laughing with James, she knew it couldn't last. Jack Blackwood wasn't the kind of man to let go, and every time she passed by the front window, she couldn't help but glance outside, half expecting to see a black car parked across the street. She wasn't safe, not yet, and deep down she knew. Her past was coming for her. The night was quiet, too quiet. Helen stood at the entrance of the cafe, locking up for the night. The air smelled of rain, the streets slick from an earlier drizzle. The city was winding down, streetlights flickered, casting long shadows over the pavement. She sighed, rolling her shoulders. It had been a long shift, but she didn't mind. For the first time in her life, work made her feel alive. She turned, about to call out to James when she saw it, a black car, parked across the street. Her breath caught in her throat. Number, no, no, no. Her fingers clenched around the keys. Her heart pounded so loudly she could hear it in her ears. It could be a coincidence, just another car on the street, but her gut told her otherwise. Then the door opened. A man in a black suit stepped out. Then another and another. Helen's stomach twisted into a knot of fear. She knew those men, Jack's men. They had found her. Run! Her body reacted before her mind did. She spun around, sprinting back toward the alley behind the cafe, but she barely made it 2 steps before a strong hand clamped down on her wrist. "Where do you think you're going, princess?" A rough voice growled in her ear. She kicked, struggled, but another set of hands grabbed her. "You thought you could run from Mr. Blackwood?" one of them sneered. Her blood went cold at Jack's name. She fought hard. Helen screamed, twisting, trying to break free. Then she heard a voice, his voice. "Let her go, James!" He charged forward, fists clenched. He shoved one of the men back, knocking him into the cafe window with a dull thud. Helen's chest tightened. "Number James, don't!" But it was too late. One of Jack's men swung. A fist slammed into James's ribs. He grunted but didn't go down. He threw a punch of his own, but there were too many of them. Another hit, then another. James staggered back, gasping for breath. Helen screamed, "Stop, please!" But they didn't stop. 2 of the men shoved James away like he was nothing, sending him crashing to the pavement. Helen struggled harder, but the grip on her arms tightened. "Enough!" one of the men snapped. The last thing she saw was James, lying on the ground, his face twisted in pain, and then a black hood. Darkness. The car smelled of leather and cigarette smoke. The seats were cold, unfamiliar. Helen's hands were tied, her heart pounding against her ribs. She tried to keep calm, think. But her mind was a blur of fear and anger. The man in the passenger seat glanced back at her, smirking. "You gave us quite the chase, Miss Carter." Helen glared at him. "Let me go." He laughed. "You really think this is a choice?" Her nails dug into her palms. Jack planned this. Of course he did. He had power, money, control. He owned people, bent them to his will. Helen had thought she could escape him. She had been wrong. The driver made a sharp turn. Helen's body lurched, her shoulder slamming into the door. She winced but didn't cry out. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She wouldn't be weak. She wouldn't let Jack win. But as the city lights blurred past the windows, one thought consumed her. Was James okay? Did they hurt him? Was he still breathing? She swallowed back the lump in her throat. She had run for freedom. And now she was being dragged back into her cage, back to Jack, back to hell. The moment Helen stepped into Jack Blackwood's mansion, a wave of dread crashed over her. The grand hall was cold, the marble floors polished to perfection, reflecting the dim glow of the chandeliers above. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. She wasn't the same Helen Carter who had walked away from this life just weeks ago. She had tasted freedom, she had felt warmth, and now she was being dragged back into her cage. Two of Jack's men shoved her forward. She stumbled but caught herself, lifting her chin in defiance. If she was going to face Jack, she wouldn't do it on her knees. She heard slow, deliberate footsteps echo through the room. Then he appeared. Jack Blackwood, dressed in an expensive black suit, his face unreadable, his eyes as sharp as glass shards. He stared at her for a long moment, his gaze filled with something she couldn't quite place. Then he spoke. "You embarrassed me, Helen." His voice was quiet, too quiet, and that terrified her more than if he had yelled. He took a step closer, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. "But I'll give you one last chance." Helen's heart pounded. "Number, not this, not again." Jack smirked, tilting his head slightly as if studying her. "Marry me, and I'll forget this ever happened." A suffocating, heavy silence. Helen clenched her fists. Her entire body trembled, not with fear, but with rage. "You think you can just—" She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You think I'll just say yes? After everything?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "You belong here, Helen. You were born for this world. Running away doesn't change that." Her stomach twisted. He said it so casually, as if her pain, her choices, her very existence meant nothing to him. Of course they didn't. Jack Blackwood didn't love her. He didn't even like her. She was just a possession, a prize to be won, a bargaining chip in his endless game of power. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I'd rather die than marry a man like you." The air in the room shifted. Jack's smirk faded. For the first time something flickered in his expression, something dangerous. And then he laughed, a slow, calculated laugh, sending a chill down her spine. He turned away, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, as if this was all some annoying inconvenience. But when he spoke again, his voice was like ice. "Then I'll ruin the man who helped you." Helen froze, her breath caught in her throat. Jack's gaze slid back to her, amusement dancing in his dark eyes. "That Daniel, was it?" Helen gasped. "Number, not James, not him." Jack stepped closer, invading her space, his voice like a venomous whisper. "You don't seem to understand, Helen. I always win, and when someone crosses me, I don't just punish them." He leaned in, his breath brushing against her ear. "I destroy them." Helen's entire body went numb. Images of James flashed in her mind. His laughter, his kindness, the way he had fought for her without hesitation. Jack would ruin him, destroy his life, his job, his home, everything. He would make sure James never found peace again, and it would be her fault. A sharp pain stabbed through her chest. Jack straightened, adjusting his tie, watching her fall apart in silence. "Now," he said simply, as if they were discussing a business deal, "you have a choice." Helen's nails dug into her palms. She had wanted to fight. She had sworn she would never surrender. But now James's life was at stake, and suddenly she wasn't fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for him. Her heart pounded, her lips parted, and she made the worst decision of her life. "I'll marry you." The walls of Jack Blackwood's empire had always been built on fear. Fear of his power, fear of his influence, fear of what would happen if someone dared to challenge him. But fear only lasts as long as people believe in it, and James didn't believe in it at all. James had barely made it out alive the night Helen was taken. His body still ached from being shoved aside, his knuckles still bruised from punching one of Jack's men in a desperate attempt to stop them. But none of that mattered now. The moment Helen was dragged back into that mansion, James had made a decision. He wasn't going to let Jack win. So he did something no one had ever dared to do before. He spoke out. He went straight to the press, ignoring every warning in his mind that told him Jack was too powerful, that speaking up would get him destroyed. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Helen, and if there was one thing James knew, it was that Helen deserved to be free. The first news story broke within hours, then another, then 100 more. Billionaire Jack Blackwood forcing woman into marriage. Jack Blackwood's bride goes missing, but there's more to the story. Exposing the dark side of power. A survivor speaks out. James gave an exclusive interview, sitting in front of flashing cameras, his jaw tight, his voice unwavering. This isn't just about Helen, he told them. This is about powerful men thinking they can own people. Jack Blackwood thinks he's untouchable, but no one is untouchable, not if we stand together. His words spread like wildfire. Social media exploded, started trending worldwide. People were outraged. They flooded Jack's company accounts with demands for justice. Protests broke out outside Blackwood Industries' headquarters. Celebrities, activists, even some politicians spoke up against Jack. And then, his investors started to panic. Inside his mansion, Jack stood in front of a wall of TV screens, each one playing a different news report about him. His hands were clenched into fists, his jaw locked tight. His perfect, untouchable world was crumbling. "This is a lie," he growled, slamming his fist against the table. "No one turns on me. No one." But it was already happening. Investors pulled out. Stock prices plummeted. Board members started resigning. The world had stopped fearing Jack Blackwood. And without fear, he was nothing. Helen sat in her room, staring at the flickering screen of her phone. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the thousands, millions of messages of support. People believed her. They were fighting for her. James was fighting for her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she read his words, his voice echoing in her heart. This isn't just about Helen. This is about powerful men thinking they can own people. Helen took a deep breath. For so long, she had believed she was powerless, that she was trapped. But now she saw the truth. Jack's power only worked if people feared him, and she wasn't afraid anymore. She rose to her feet, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in forever, she felt stronger than him. She felt free, and she was about to prove to the world that Jack Blackwood didn't own her, not anymore. The walls of Jack Blackwood's prison had always felt impenetrable. But today, they crumbled. Jack sat in his grand office, his fingers digging into the edge of his desk. His empire was on the brink of collapse, his perfectly constructed world burning around him. And at the center of it all, Helen. His men had warned him. The protests outside his office grew louder every hour. His company's stock had dropped so low, investors were pulling out faster than he could react. And worst of all, he had lost control. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one giving orders. He was the one backed into a corner, and Helen was standing tall. She stood before him, her chin lifted, her eyes burning with defiance. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Jack." Her voice was steady, unshakable. Jack scoffed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had power. He had money. That had always been enough. So why wasn't it enough now? "You think you've won?" His voice was sharp, but Helen didn't even flinch. "I don't think," she said, taking a step closer. "I know." Jack's jaw clenched. This woman, the one he had once thought weak, helpless, just another pawn in his game, was standing before him, more powerful than she had ever been. Not because of money, not because of status, but because of courage, because she had stood up when no one else would, and now Jack had nothing left to threaten her with. The weight of it settled over him, and for the first time he felt small, defeated. His lips curled into a bitter sneer. "Fine." His voice was low, venomous. "Get out of my sight." Helen exhaled, a rush of relief washing over her. She had won. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't run. She didn't stumble. She walked with power, with purpose, with freedom. And Jack Blackwood, the man who had once controlled her fate, could do nothing to stop her. The city felt different as Helen walked through the streets. It wasn't just the buildings or the people. It was her. She had spent her whole life feeling trapped, controlled, defined by the world around her. But now she was free. The moment she reached James's apartment, she didn't hesitate. She knocked once, then twice. Then the door flew open, and there he was. James. His worried eyes softened the second he saw her. "Helen," he whispered, his voice raw, as if he hadn't let himself believe this moment was real. She didn't speak. She just threw herself into his arms, and James caught her, held her tighter than ever before, breathed her in as if he had been afraid he'd never get to again. "You're free now," he whispered, his lips brushing against her hair. Tears slipped down Helen's cheeks, but this time, they weren't tears of pain or fear. They were tears of freedom, of love, because for the first time in her life, she belonged exactly where she was, and she had chosen it all on her own. The wind was warm against Helen's skin as she stood atop a hill overlooking the city, a city she no longer feared. She had escaped its suffocating grip, the chains of her past now nothing but distant echoes, and standing beside her, James. Their hands weren't intertwined, not yet, but the warmth between them was undeniable. Helen never believed in fairy tales. She knew that love wasn't about instant sparks or grand gestures. It was about time, patience, and understanding. James never rushed her. He never demanded anything. He simply stood by her side, guiding her into a world she had never known, a world without greed, control, or cruelty, a world where she was allowed to be herself. And as the days turned to months, Helen felt something shift inside her, a warmth, a pull, a feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be. One evening, as they sat by a small fire in the countryside, Helen turned to him. Her heart pounded, but she didn't hesitate. "You changed my life, James." He smiled softly. "You changed your own life, Helen. I just stood beside you." Her breath hitched, because that was love, not possession, not control, just standing beside someone, no matter what. Helen had never felt safer in her entire life. Helen had been born into wealth, but for the first time, she knew how to use it. She and James traveled from city to city, searching for those who needed a second chance, just like she once did. She used her resources to open shelters for women escaping abusive relationships. She built education centers for underprivileged children. She fought for change in the very society that once tried to suffocate her. And James was her rock. He stood beside her, working just as hard, giving his heart and soul to the people they helped. She watched as he mentored young men, teaching them how to fight for themselves, how to survive in a world that so often turned its back on them. She saw him protect the vulnerable, his voice always firm, always steady, never backing down from injustice. And every time she looked at him, she felt it. That quiet, unshakable love. One day, while visiting one of the shelters she had built, Helen saw a young girl sitting alone in the corner of the room. The girl's arms were wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes filled with the same fear Helen once knew all too well. Helen knelt beside her, offering a gentle smile. "You're safe here," she whispered. The girl hesitated, then finally whispered back, "Are you sure?" Helen's heart clenched. She knew that fear. She had lived it, and in that moment, she realized this was why she had survived, not just for herself, but for others like her. For every person who had been silenced, beaten down, made to feel unworthy. Helen reached out, gently taking the girl's hand. "I promise." The girl's lips quivered. Then, for the first time, she nodded. And Helen knew she had made a difference. Jack Blackwood had lost everything. His company had crumbled. His wealth had vanished. And Helen, she didn't hate him. She didn't wish him suffering, because hate only poisoned the heart that carried it. So she let him go. She moved forward, carrying only love, only strength, only hope. Because in the end, that was what made her truly free. Years passed. Helen and James built a life of purpose, of kindness, of true happiness. Their love was never about grand declarations or flashy moments. It was in the way he held her hand when she was scared, in the way she laughed with him under the stars, in the way they stood together, side by side through every storm. Helen had once dreaded the idea of marriage. But when James finally knelt before her, in the middle of a quiet field, with nothing but love in his eyes and a simple ring in his hand, she said yes, not because she had to, not because society expected it, but because, for the first time in her life, she was choosing love on her own terms, and that was the greatest victory of all. Helen and James had built a life together, one filled with purpose, love, and unwavering strength. But the world around them, it was still full of judgment. People whispered behind their backs. Some looked at James with disapproval, their eyes filled with prejudice just because of his skin color. Others told Helen she had betrayed her status, that she didn't belong in his world. And yet, they never backed down. They never let hate define their love. One evening, they were walking through a park when a man sneered at them. "You don't belong together," he muttered, shaking his head in disgust. Helen's fingers tightened around James's hand, her anger rising. But James, he just smiled sadly. "Love doesn't come with rules," he said calmly. The man scoffed. "People like you don't mix." Helen stepped forward, her voice steady and strong. "People like us?" she asked. "We are just two human beings who chose each other. Why does that bother you?" The man had no answer, because there was no real answer, just centuries of ignorance, fear, and division. James squeezed Helen's hand. "We don't have to fight hate with hate," he whispered. And he was right, because their love was the loudest protest of all. Helen knew that love alone wasn't enough to change the world. Action was needed. So she and James took their fight further. They started a foundation, Unity House, a safe space for interracial couples, minorities, and people who had faced discrimination. They traveled to schools, businesses, and communities, speaking about the power of love over hate. They educated, empowered, and uplifted, and slowly, change began. James knew what was coming. The hate in their eyes was all too familiar. "Stay away from our people," one of them spat. Helen's heart raced. Not again. Not this. James took a deep breath, and then, instead of fighting with fists, he asked them a simple question. "What are you so afraid of?" The men hesitated, because deep down, hate is just fear in disguise. James continued, "Does my love for her take anything away from you?" Silence. Then one of them stepped back, confusion in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, something inside him had shifted. Helen and James didn't end racism overnight, but they planted seeds. They proved that love doesn't see color, status, or wealth. It sees the heart. And those seeds, they grew, one person at a time, one mind at a time, until finally, one day their future children would walk freely, without judgment, without fear, because of what they fought for today. And that was their greatest legacy. This isn't just a story about a woman escaping a forced marriage. It's about breaking the chains of hate, greed, and ignorance. It's about choosing love, even when the world tries to stop you. It's about understanding that no one is born hating. Hate is taught, but so is love, and love always wins.